the things that she has done. She is exactly the kind of dynamic leader that we need in Rotary as we grow. And this club is focused on the right things, I believe. My career has been interesting, over 50 years in the world of work. I was in the Air Force for a full career, retired as a colonel in the Air Force, was a fighter pilot, flew a few hundred combat missions. I think what I've got out of all of that is that we are one world, and I may be a very proud citizen of the United States, but I can be homesick for many lands that we lived in. And I see an opportunity for us to work together collaboratively to do better things. There's much that faces us right now. We look at politics in an election year. We look at the toll that COVID has taken, and we look at the impact on the economy. But over the long haul, over the decades, what will transcend that is going to be how we treat this environment, this earth that we live in, how we care for it. I think it's very fitting that Rotary has adopted a new focus area in the environment. I think this club is focused correctly. I told Peely I was going to give her the reverse speaker fee, which meant I donated $50 in happy dollars. But after looking at all you've done, I decided up it to $100. So you get $100 for a project. So there you go. So I guess we can move ahead. This briefing will be informal. I hope you'll ask questions, throw rocks at me. The slides aren't the best. They were made by a government agency. I am not a Fish and Wildlife Service employee. I'm retired from 3 careers, 1 in the Air Force and 2 in executive positions in 2 Fortune 500 companies in the aerospace industry. But I started out to be a biologist, a zoologist by formal training, and it's always been a passion. So I've been a bird nerd and a wildlife nerd and an environmental nerd since I was a little kid. I got my first binocular at the age of 8, and I still remember individual days and what I have seen from that age. So that's a passion. So we're going to talk a little bit about these postage stamps that are Oahu's wildlife refuges. And then I'm going to tell you a few things about the stars of the refuge, which isn't the people, it's the birds and the creatures that are there. So if we might, I think we'll proceed and see how this goes. Peely, are you driving slides? Perfect, okay. And now, since we're, I think, co-hosts, can you see my cursor moving around? Good, okay, thank you. Refuges are scattered across the United States. They're precious places. Some are huge. I've kayaked for days in refuges in some of the Western states. I'm sort of an everything, scuba diver, hunter, fisherman, and everything else in the wildlife. So in Alaska, I've rafted for days in the Innoko and watched birds and wildlife and photographed, hunted a few ducks for dinner, shot a big bull moose, and then dragged all of it back and shared the meat with the Athapascan families that needed that for their winter sustenance. Those are the kinds of things that may happen on some very large refuges. Oahu's refuges are tiny, and they are not accessible for hunting and fishing. These are primarily precious refuges in a place with very few places where our wildlife can find home. For our forest birds, our big problem is avian malaria and bird pox. This was brought to the islands. I'll move the slides in a minute, Peely. I just wanted to chat through this. Was brought here by folks who introduced birds to the lowland areas of Hawaii, not understanding why they no longer had the native birds. Those birds from Asia, from America, from Central America, carried wildlife diseases to which our birds, like the Hawaiian people, had no immunity. That was all well until mosquitoes were accidentally introduced. And when they were, these little nasty Culex mosquitoes that annoy us on the trails out there near Aina or anywhere in the mountains here are the ones that carry malaria. Some of our birds have learned resistance and have begun to move back down into the wild area, into the lower areas. But some, like our iconic Eevee and others, one mosquito bite is usually fatal within 36 hours. There are many programs to address this now, but that's the issue for forest birds. For our birds that are associated with the shoreline and the wetlands, they're pretty immune to the disease. They see migrant birds regularly. Their problem is no home to live in. So let's see if we can move to our next slide. So the complex on Oahu, unlike these big refuges in Alaska, is a series of relatively small areas. We'll talk about a couple of those in detail. The James Campbell National Wildlife Refuge, located up at Kaka'ako at the very northern tip of the island, sits behind the shrimp and prawn farms that you will see when you go around the Cam Highway. Two units, Ki'i and Punamano. Ki'i is the unit where we do the tours right now. We have a forest refuge that's over 4,000 acres up in the Ko'olau, but right now it's completely hemmed in by private land. When Fish and Wildlife goes in to do surveys, they helicopter in, so we don't have access to that. And then we have three areas over here in the Pearl Harbor area. We have Wai'awa behind the Leeward Community College. We have the Honouliuli unit, which sits off West Lock, and you can go to the Bliss Overlook and see the birds that are there. And then we have a dryland unit at Kalailoa, which really preserves some of the area that was some of the first Hawaiian civilizations here 1,400 years ago when they came from Tahiti, and also is a habitat for some endangered endemic plants. Okay, next slide. So let's talk about the Ki'i unit for a minute here. It's larger now, but initially as established, it was 127 units, and established in 1976 to provide habitat for primarily for 4 endangered endemic species, also for our migratory water birds that come to us from Alaska, from Canada, and from Siberia through the fall and winter season. The history of this is, well, let me talk about James Campbell for a minute. James Campbell is an interesting guy. Came from the British Isles at the age of 12, wound up in New England and then New York, learned carpentry, sailed on a whaling vessel, eventually was shipwrecked off the Tuamotu archipelago with 2 shipmates, and the natives were going to put them to death, and Campbell convinced them he had useful carpentry skills, so they spared their lives. They lived with the natives for 2 years. They were picked up by another whaling vessel and brought to Maui. And on Maui, he at first was a carpenter and an entrepreneurial guy, eventually developed a partnership with some other folks and bought what became the Pioneer Sugar Mill. That mill operated for years and closed in 2000. So he became a baron in the sugar industry, married into a well-connected family in Hawaiian royalty. In time, his daughter, Abigail, married Prince Kawananakoa, an heir to the throne. So they were very well connected with the Hawaiian kingdom, and in fact were strong supporters of Queen Liliuokalani against the overthrow by the Americans. In time, he became the largest landholder, and they developed artesian well technology. So eventually, all this land over here in Ewa Beach and Kapolei, as well as areas up along the North Shore here, became part of the estate of James Campbell. And in 1976, when the sugar mill closed down, and that's the mill in Kaka'ako that you will see as kind of a tourist place when you go through there, closed down, then those ponds, which had been settling ponds for all of the wash water and effluent from washing the sugar cane, began to silt in and fill in. Fish and Wildlife Service approached the Campbell estate and got a lease on this unit and the Punamano unit and operated that to begin to care for the ponds. This had always been a wetland area. In ancient times, this was an ahupua'a operated under a sub-chief with related Hawaiian families that managed shore resources, freshwater marine resources, grew kalo in the lowlands, harvested timber, and traded among themselves. So it's always been a wetland area subject to periodic flooding. Next chart. Okay, this is what it kind of looks like from the air. In the bottom, these rectangular ponds are ponds from the prawn and shrimp industries. These are the ones that are operated by Fumi's with the blue shack out there. She sells a lot of shrimp. She's the epicenter of garlic shrimp on the Cam Highway. Uh, these are operated by Romy with the red shack, and he grows freshwater prawns. Fumi no longer grows her shrimp here. She brings them in from Thailand and Vietnam because it's cheaper to do that. This area now has become, with the expansion, part of the wildlife refuge, and they will continue to operate under an easement for a number of years. They don't do predator control, but they have some habitat for the shorebirds. This area is over in here. These ponds are part of the Ki'i unit. So when we take you on tours, you come into the refuge, and by the way, this is just almost across the street from Gunstock Ranch, where we're going to do the tree planting. In fact, the tractor supervisor there is a member of the Gunstock Ranch family. So you come in, you go to the kiosk, we talk to you a little bit about refuge management. We do a couple-hour walking tour through these ponds to see the birds there. We bring scopes, we bring binoculars, and we teach refuge management and something about the birds in the refuge. We is the volunteer cadre. We have 5 of us and we're all volunteers. None of us are Fish and Wildlife Service employees. With the expansion of the refuge in 2007, as I recall, this area grew and it included management of these dunes out here. This is the northernmost point of the island at Kahuku. And this is a good area for sea turtles to nest, for monk seals to haul out and pup, for wedge-tailed shearwaters and yellow-faced bees as habitat for their needs. And so you actually can walk in from Turtle Bay and you can walk along the dunes and fish up to the high tide line, but not in the vegetation up here. We used to have people in there running dogs in there. We had horses and cattle in there. We had people running ATVs over the shearwater burrows and squashing them. That's all gone now. So there are some signs there are some restrictions, but it is actually a very precious area. The other thing I'll talk to, and it's just off the slide over here, is a nonprofit called Pacific Rim Conservation is doing reintroductions of species that used to be on the islands historically and were eliminated by man-introduced predators. They started with Laysan albatrosses like the ones at Kaena Point, which nest on the refuge occasionally naturally. They graduated to black-footed albatrosses and now to the bonin petrel and Tristram storm petrels behind a predator-proof fence. These birds have hatched now over several years and gone to sea. They're long-lived birds. Unlike chickens, which lay a lot of eggs, live fast, and die young, these birds live very long lives, as long as humans. It takes them years to mature. They may raise 1 chick every year or 1 chick every other year, and those chicks take 5 or 6 years to mature themselves. So these birds are now that have been released from there are beginning to come back and will establish colonies. This is important because while this area looks fairly low, these dunes are pretty high. The areas on the northwest chain where they nest are being inundated by rising seas with global warming. So this provides them a refugium of some decades or even centuries before their habitat will be threatened. So it's important work. Next slide. Okay, this is what a pond looks like. They're shallow, they're freshwater. They're usually not more than about 18 inches deep. There's an artesian well plus rainwater, and the water flows generally in a northwesterly direction toward the sea. These little islands in here, which become more apparent as we draw the water level down, are where a lot of the birds will nest. Nesting season is in the summer, which is why the tours are not run in the summer. There's a small moat around here to reduce intrusions by cats, rats, and mongooses, which prey on these birds. This is one of the big problems here, this carpet of tall plants here. They're good habitat in small areas, but when they choke out an area like this, the birds can't use it. These are California bulrushes and cattails, which are introduced. So the refuge has to come in draw the water level down and either burn or mow those plants, then raise the water level to where it's suitable for the birds. But they have 2 people to do this, and it's pretty constant management. So it's a big chore. We may be able to help that a bit. Next slide. These are some of the birds that are intended recipients of what the refuge provides. The Hawaiian stilt, or Io, which is, these are basically long-legged sandpipers with a tuxedo. Neat birds. They are a well-marked subspecies of the stilts found on the mainland of the US, but they're behaviorally and genetically enough distinct. I think they will probably be named as a separate species, which will be endangered. The Hawaiian gallinule, Alaiula, down here at the bottom, kind of an all-purpose bird, runs well on land, feeds on land, swims well, works through the reeds. The Hawaiian coot, Alaikeokeo, is, while it looks like the coots on the mainland, is in fact a species found only in Hawaii and mostly on the islands of Oahu and Kauai. And then our Hawaiian duck, Kaloa maoli, which is an endemic native species. So this is their home. There aren't many other places for them, and it's important that we do something for them. I personally have seen 2 Hawaiian species years ago that are no longer with us. They've become extinct. So while we are a diversity capital for avian citizens, we've also become the extinction capital. So part of this is places for them to live. Next slide. This is the other unit there, Punamano. Right now, Punamano is not open to the public, but I'm sorry, up in here. It is the larger of the 2 units. And of course, in 2007, through Senator Inouye and others, we gained the intervening areas there. So the refuge is larger. Where this will factor when I get to my last slide about our friends group is that we envision with the Fish and Wildlife Serving having a visitor center and having interpretive trails through this area where you can walk through without having to wait for a guided tour to greatly increase public access. Fish and Wildlife Service is all in favor of this. After we push this, they have now put this in the performance plans for the refuge staff and manager. And the senior guy in the Pacific Refuges has talked with me in the past week and said, we're going to get this done. So it's going to be good work. Next slide, please. And this is just an aerial shot of Punamano. There's a number of things to do there, but we will get it done. And we'll probably ask some of you if you're interested in helping on some of the projects or interested in becoming members of the Friends group. Thanks. Next. I'm going to move to the Pearl Harbor Refuge. If you thought the James Campbell unit was small, these are really small, 25 acres at Waiava. This unit and the other units of Pearl Harbor were established as mitigation. You've all landed on runway 8 right at Honolulu International Airport. You'll notice that it's dredged up out of the ocean, and that dredging and filling destroyed wetlands and reefs off Pearl Harbor. So these units were established as mitigation. Next slide. So this is a pond you'll recognize behind Leeward Community College. You'll recognize the Twin Towers. These are brackish water, not quite fresh. There's a stream that flows in through the Watercress Farm, comes into the area. And this is actually quite good breeding territory for our endangered species. Same ones that breed up on James Campbell. It's also really good wintering habitat for waterfowl from up in the north, as well as shorebirds. Next slide. Okay, the other unit, Honouliuli, a little bit bigger, established for the same purposes. Next slide. This one you can visit. If you go to the bike path behind Westlock Shoreline Park, you can go to the Bliss Overlook and you can stand up and look out over this view. Now, right now the vegetation was cleared here, but it's a good place to scope or watch with a binocular or naked eye the the water birds that are in this refuge. And it's really quite a good, although small place. If members of the club are interested in the future and learning more about the birds here, and it's best during the winter, I'd be happy to go out there with scopes and binoculars and have people join me and teach you something about the refuge and the birds. Thanks. Next slide. The third unit is Kalailoa, which I mentioned, and you can flip to the slide for that one. It's up on the dry Eva plain within the old Barbers Point area. Next slide, if you will, Peely. Thank you. It's uplifted reef. It looks dry and scrubby, but among these plants, there are some endangered endemic species found primarily on the Eva plain. There are also interesting habitations here where you see sinkholes in the karst there. And the first inhabitants to come to this area 1,400 years ago came from Tahiti, realized it was a harsh climate, it was windy and dry, but by going into those holes and establishing tiers where they could cultivate plants below the level of the constant wind and the drought and could irrigate them, they were able to sustain life here. So it was an interesting culture. This is an interesting place to see. Next slide, please. And then we have the forest area. Forest areas on Oahu are interesting. You can get up and hike in them in either the Ko'olau Range, where this area is, or in the Waianae Range. One problem with these areas is that at a top elevation of about 4,100 feet, they're not quite above the mosquitoes. Where they're fairly dry, we don't have a lot of mosquitoes, and so avian malaria is not really strong. 3 species, the Apapane, the Elapaio, and the Oahu Amakihi, have learned resistance to malaria and have now begun to move back down into lower areas. But for many of our species, one kiss from a mosquito is death. So we have lost some of the rarest birds up there. There's much we can do, though, and there are programs to eliminate mosquitoes at the higher elevation that may eventually bear fruit. So this area is good for some of our endangered plants, tree snails, and a few of the remaining endangered birds. Next slide. It's not all completely native species. You see these 2 tall cook pines. So many of these highland areas were once farmed. There's a kukui tree down here. You can argue about whether kukui was a Polynesian introduction or native, probably a Polynesian introduction. Next slide. But we do have koa trees. We have alahei, Canthium, and we have Fresinetia or EA vines here. So we have quite a few natives, not all endemic, found through other areas in the islands or through Polynesia. But some like koa, obviously, and this Fresinetia are endemic to the Hawaiian Islands. So it's a pretty neat place, as are these other high island refuges. Okay, next slide. I guess this is in case I'm the butt of your jokes or hindsight or something. But while we have this flock of alai'ula up here, I'm going to use that to talk a little bit about the amazing inhabitants here. Some, like these guys, migrated here, became slightly different from the mainland birds, and now they are their own distinct subspecies or species in the case of the coots. But a lot of the other birds that we get on the refuges are our, what many people like to think of are winter visitors. Northern birds that come here for the winter. That's our mainland bias showing. They're not northern birds that came here for the winter. These are our tropical birds, just like our orioles and tanagers and warblers on the mainland. These are tropical birds that go north for a brief summer, I want to say vacation, but they're really busting their butt. So if we take the kolea, the little golden plovers that arrive, most of them farm out to their habitats today and tomorrow, the 4th and 5th of August, and you'll see them on the lawns. These birds will be here. They will establish territories and they will feed. And they'll come to the same territory year after year. Some that I banded on Hickam came back 13 years in a row. On the 25th or 26th of April, they'll be all stoked up on food and they will fly to Alaska. or to Siberia. And they will mate and they will nest and they will raise their young with that huge flush of life that occurs in the summer up there. Then they'll abandon their young, stoke up on insects and then on berries and fly back to Hawaii. Kids will be left behind. Unlike cranes and geese, which teach their young where to go, these little guys are born with the innate knowledge of where they need to go and many, many means to find it there. It's probably too extensive a topic to talk to today, but they launch after the parents and go to where they're supposed to go. So it was interesting that we always thought that 2,500 or 3,000 miles was a long journey. Not so much. Put satellite trackers on some of these young birds, and one of them took off launching for Hawaii, except it launched too far east, and it missed Hawaii completely, and it kept flying south. It got all the way to the equator and went, something's wrong, I'm too far south. And it turned west and flew along the equator, and it flew and flew and flew nonstop. Something said, something's wrong, I'm too far south, and it turned north. And it landed in Okinawa, Japan, and it spent the winter in Okinawa, fattened up and went back to its place in Alaska. It did that nonstop. Birds can shut down half their brain and sleep while they're aloft. Their digestive tract atrophies before they leave to save weight. They bulk up 40% of their weight in fat, and when it's time to go, that's all they do. If they land in the water, they're doomed. So they fly until they find land or perish. Pretty amazing journeys. I asked some people to calculate how many grams of fat that bird burned on that journey and how many calories there were. And we converted that to calories in gasoline. That bird got 285,000 miles per gallon. So when you run a marathon and you buy a Tesla and you feel good, think about these little athletes. You could buy your car, fill it with gas, drive it till the wheels fell off, siphon out half a tank of gas for your next ride. That's environmental awareness. So we have some amazing stars here. Our little bristle-thighed curlews with their curved beaks have learned to fish out crayfish, which were introduced, and Pomacea apple snails, which were brought in for escargot. They bring them up, find a hard place on land, smash them on it, take them apart, and eat them. And that's their primary diet here for these scarce birds that come down from Alaska for the winter. They're doing great on seafood. They have not yet invented the secret of cocktail sauce. So I guess evolution takes a while. But at any rate, those are some of our stars on the Refuge. Last slide, please. We're working to establish a friends group. Fish and Wildlife fully supports this. I will charter that within the next month. I'll fund it initially. This, by the way, was built for a friends conference, is why it shows the documents. But anyway, we will be an approved 501c3. We will work with the Fish and Wildlife Service to get a visitor center built up there and a drive-through area, remove some old facilities, and then we need to talk about what we display. I think we will primarily display what's to be seen on our Oahu refuges. We're going to have some, probably some dioramas that talk to Midway and the Pacific Islands out of Papahanaumokuakea, where most of us cannot visit. And the Fish and Wildlife Service is anticipating, once this is fully up and running, that we will probably get 300,000 visitors a year. We'll probably sell some t-shirts and books. But I've picked my directors. We'll get this started. I don't want to run it forever. I'm running enough other things. But I do want this to succeed because I think it's a precious opportunity for us. And once we're established, we'll have very reasonable memberships and student memberships. I'd encourage you to join, and I'd encourage you to come out and visit and see what these precious places of wildland have to offer. So mahalo for your time. I'll entertain your questions. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Dick. That was really great. If you guys have questions, you can type it in the chat box.
Yeah, I'll be watching chat.
And I guess, yeah, we can read it out. I guess just to start, some form of question. Something that I've noticed is that a lot of the endemic plant species have occurred at lower elevations. And a lot of the remaining native plants seem to be at higher elevations. Do you have any knowledge as to why that is, or why that's become the case?
Sure. The trouble, if Darwin had discovered Hawaii first, he'd never wasted his time in the Galapagos. This is, in fact, the greatest laboratory on Earth for adaptive radiation, particularly among birds. So they adapted to all habitats and all types of structures and beak styles and everything else. When the first people arrived here, the first Polynesians, they found flightless native birds that were large and tasty, the moanalo, the various types of geese and rails, and they ate them out of existence. And they also cleared many of the lowland rainforests or lowland dry forests. When Cook discovered the islands, there were 350,000 Polynesians living here, so this was not an unpopulous place. Nobody was deliberately trying to destroy anything, but again, you've got a lot of people and hungry people, and no one until very recently understood the consequences of our actions. Then came the Europeans and the Americans, and we brought our agricultural practices. We dropped off cattle, we dropped off sheep, we dropped off goats, we dropped off dogs and pigs and cats and rats and mongooses. So we had predators in an environment where there was no resistance to disease and no awareness of predators. Initially, people wondered why birds were disappearing from the lowland. And it wasn't until relatively recently that we realized that they were retreating as the mosquitoes, which had been accidentally introduced, transmitted avian malaria and bird pox, mostly malaria. And it's not a type of malaria, it's Plasmodium falciparum, so it doesn't affect humans, but it does affect birds rather dramatically. It doesn't affect our introduced birds much. They're used to it. They're immune to it largely. They'll carry it at high levels. And interestingly enough, the 3 endemic species that have developed resistance can carry a high plasmodium load and rid themselves of it. But again, they could be carriers for the other more sensitive birds. So what's happened is the birds have retreated. There were relatively small numbers of them anyway. Now they're dispersed over a larger area. And it's difficult for enough of them to get together to breed, to perpetuate the species. There are a number of initiatives to eliminate mosquitoes, biological controls and genetic controls that might give us some time. The other thing that helps is plantings. We're going to plant lowland trees, but over at Hakalau, for example, they're upslope planting koa, and what they found is when they plant koa as a native tree, you get this huge resurgence of all these once thought extinct plants in the understory. And you build this marvelous environment. And when you walk through there, what you hear is lots of bird song, and it's native birds. So you're planting up, you're staying ahead of the mosquitoes, which are tropical birds. So it really, I think, will be a matter of a bit of a race against time in the mosquitoes. But I'm optimistic that we will win this race for many of the species now extant. There may be a few that we lose. We've lost one that was discovered, the Po'uli on Maui was discovered in 1973 and became extinct probably in 1990. So we have a very small dispersed population. There's only so much you can do, but there is much that we can do. And I think the tree planting is great. I think things that we can do that help us to preserve the higher areas on the higher islands will help quite a bit.
So there is another few questions in the box. One of those is how long it will take to get chartered?
To get, I'm sorry?
How long do you think it will take you to get chartered?
I think that I'm going to work with, I'm going to probably hire an attorney. I'm going to fund this initially. I don't know how much. I'm probably going to put $10,000 in it out of my pocket just so we have something to get started. I'm guessing that we will have a friends agreement done and be up and running by fall, by early fall.
Okay, but this fall or next year fall?
This year.
Wow, that's great. So John Baranello asked, that how we can get involved in an explorative trip or
what I plan to do, like anything else, is pick the initial directors, hold a meeting, get everything chartered, elect our officers, which is going to be president, vice president, secretary, and treasurer. I really need somebody who's going to be web savvy to help us with some of that. And so we will be looking for directors. And like I said, I have no desire to be the king of this thing forever. I want to make sure it starts and then be part of it, but move it forward. So I think in serving as members of the Friends group, in attending some of the things that we do when we open up opportunities to visit and do stuff. So there's going to be a ton of things we can do. Let me address one or the two other questions that people asked about on the chat, if I could. Close encounter with a tiger shark. Yeah, I'm a scuba diver. I usually try to swim around those. How much pressure does stray cat population put on native bird species? Huge, unfortunately. The primary, the Oahu elapaya, which is found only on the island, is actually quite immune to avian malaria, but they are endangered. And the primary threat happens to be, because we've done numerous studies on it, happens to be predation by cats and black rats on nesting females, because they're a low elevation bird. The Paleola, which is an endangered honey creeper found up on Mauna Kea, the primary cause of death is that they nest rather low, and feral cats kill them on the nest when they're incubating. So yes, cats are a big problem. Cats, mongooses, and dogs obviously are removed from the refuges, but elsewhere it's a big issue. Mongooses, of course, are particularly insidious because they don't climb well, but they can get a hold of ground nesting birds, and they are really tough on seabirds in colonies. Most of the seabirds nest in burrows. Seabirds have no awareness of what a predator is. They'll sit there and something will walk up and grab them and eat them, and they just have nothing in their genetic makeup that says this is something I should defend against or flee from. So what else?
Let's do the last question, Dick, and then we can, because it's 7:01 already. So let's do the last question.
If you go to the refuge itself, you should be able to call it up by just Googling up James Campbell National Wildlife Refuge. They have a website. The one thing I will tell you is uncertain right now is every year we run tours. The 5 of us as volunteers love to do that. When the tours run, if the tours run, the tours are about 2 hours. They are on level grassy areas. We will teach you about the birds and the management. They're fun. They run at 9 o'clock every Saturday morning and 4 p.m. every Thursday afternoon from the open season, which is October through February. This year might be different because we have our good friend COVID-19, our fuzzy little outer space fellow. And so there are restrictions that the federal government has in terms of group size. And I said, no problem, in groups of 10, we'll take groups of 10, we'll socially distance, and we'll put multiple guides out. But there are other issues that their government is working through with terms of sanitization of facilities and everything else. So that's a work in progress. Please stay tuned. I will keep this club involved. Thanks, Kelly.
Sounds great.
Thanks, Dick.
Kelly does good work. Always glad.
I think that it was a great meeting. Thank you so much, Dick, for coming and for sharing all your knowledge and all your savvy about birds and wildlife. Our club very looks forward to help out in camp and to do some volunteer work. I know that right now it's kind of hard to have some logistics on it because we don't know what's gonna happen. But I think that like you just let us know how and when, and we'll be able to put something together and be there.
We will let you know. And you had your birthdays, but I feel that I should mention, even though I'm not a member of this club, that my birthday is August 21st. So as I mentioned earlier in the pre-meeting, thank you for having me. I will be donating $100 happy dollars to your club to use for one of your projects. So Peely, you do good work.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dick. So
That's my birthday too.
whose birthday?
Jake.
Jake, you were late.
I was late.
Leos
We
of the
already
world.
honor you. We already honor you, Jake, and we're gonna the board of directors of Eco Rotary Club is gonna give a gift to the foundation to honor your birthday. So you will be getting a certificate tomorrow. So
I wish I weren't late.
so I forgot to mention also that Lauren is getting a certificate also and a donation to the foundation on her honor for becoming a member of our club. Awesome. Pete, you can't get both. You only you get one or birthday. So without more delay, I'm gonna share with you my screen again so we can close out the meeting. It was a great meeting with our 4-way test. So let me open up this again so I can share with you all. Okay. So, okay, if you guys want to unmute yourselves so we can all say together the 4-way test. So of the things that of what we think, say, or do. First, is it the truth? Second, is it fair
To all concerned.
Third, will it build
goodwill and better friendships.
4, will it be beneficial
to all concerned.
5th, is it fun?
Will it be fun?
For the Eco Club. 6, is it environmental and sustainable and eco-friendly?
Is environmental and eco-friendly.
Thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you.
Have a good
Thank you,
evening.
Keely.
See you next week.
Thank you.
Welcome to our new members. Happy birthday to all our birthday guys. Thanks, Dick, for coming. It was a great chat.
Aloha from Hilo.
Right.
Aloha. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you all for coming.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much.
This
Good to be here.
presentation is gonna be shared in our website. If for some reason you wanna go back to it and share with your club or just to see back again the information, it will be there.
Very nice.
Great
Meeting. Great job. Aloha.
Thank you,
Thank you.
everybody.
This was a good meeting.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Murray. Thank you. I hope, guys, you like it.
We have our meeting tomorrow at noon.
Oh,
Tomorrow.
Send me the invite. I may be able to make it.
Okay, wonderful. I will.
Okay, thank you, Sally.
Bye.
Thanks, Rogie. So, Rogie, you see Rogie there? Oh, he already left. He helped out last weekend with our volunteer projects. Okay. Have a good evening, everyone.
You too.